He shapes the appearance of the German soldier in the 20th century like hardly any other piece of military equipment: the steel helmet. It first appears in 1916, in the Battle of Verdun. It saves the lives of numerous soldiers, becomes a symbol of toughness and willingness to sacrifice, but also of hostility to democracy and the horrors of war. World War I, 21 February 1916, 7:12 a.m. French time. With a cannonade from more than 1,200 guns, a violent spectacle the world had not seen until then. One of the bloodiest battles in history begins in northeastern France. The target of the German barrage is the positions and forts around the French fortress city of Verdun. They are to be shot into a state fit for storming. After 9 hours of continuous bombardment, 6 German divisions go on the attack. Leading the way are special assault troops who are particularly trained and armed. Each fighter carries a pistol and a carbine with a bayonet fixed to it, plus 90 rounds of ammunition and several hand grenades. In addition, some of them wear a head covering never before seen, a helmet made entirely of steel. These are the first examples of that model whose distinctive basic shape, later modified several times, will shape the appearance of the German soldier for 3 decades: the Model 1916 steel helmet. 30,000 pieces of the new German helmet model had only shortly before been distributed among units on the Western Front. The steel helmets, among other things, replaced the infantry Pickelhaubes, which for more than half a century had shaped the external appearance of the Prussian-German military. The old helmets made of pressed leather with metal reinforcements and a brass spike, which were primarily intended to protect against saber blows, and still served well during the Wars of Unification from 1864 to 1870-71, no longer provide protection in the First World War. With the failure of the Schlieffen Plan and the defeat of the German armies at the Marne in 1914, fire triumphs over movement on the Western Front, in the words of the military. In the battles of the subsequent positional warfare, attacks, as in 1916 at Verdun, are prepared by hours-long massive artillery fire with high explosive and shrapnel shells. The proportion of fragment wounds on soldiers on both sides rises in the attrition battles of positional warfare to around 80%. A quarter of these are head injuries, and those are almost always fatal. After France and then Great Britain introduced steel helmets for their soldiers in 1915, voices within the German military calling for the timely equipping of the troops with a German steel protective helmet grew louder. After initial examples were successfully tested in December 1915, the Prussian War Ministry shortly thereafter ordered mass production. In January 1916, the ironworks Thala Harz delivered the first 30,000 German steel helmets to the troops. The German steel helmet Model 1916, manufactured from a 1.1 millimeter thick chrome-nickeled steel plate in 5 working steps and featuring its distinctive forehead and neck protection, soon becomes a successful model. By the end of the war, not only the armies of the German Army and the airmen of the Luftwaffe wear the M1916, but also the Allied armies of Austria-Hungary and Bulgaria. An export model without forehead and neck protection, which can also be worn during prayer, is produced for the Turkish army. After the defeat of the German Empire in 1918, the steel helmet developed strong symbolic power in the Weimar Republic. Above all, for former frontline soldiers, it becomes the emblem of toughness and willingness to sacrifice in war. The League of Frontline Soldiers, founded in December 1918 in Magdeburg, a rallying point for opponents of the Weimar democracy, names itself after it. In the Wehrmacht, the steel helmet is fundamentally further developed after the introduction of general conscription by the National Socialists in 1935. The smaller and lighter Model M35 is created, which, because of the molybdenum steel used, nevertheless has higher strength than the predecessor model. 2 slightly modified variants, the M40 and the M42, are later developed from it and delivered to the troops. One problem, however, increasingly troubles those responsible. On the 3 Wehrmacht models M35, M40, and M42, headshots frequently occur, especially at the fold lines on the forehead and neck. The designers therefore chose a more oblique shape that lets projectiles and fragments glide off more easily. The internal liner and the metal alloy of the steel helmet are also improved.
However, the mass production and delivery of the new M45 model to the Wehrmacht in 1945 does not take place. The war ends before that.
A further development of the M45 is nevertheless later built, when, in 1956, the National People's Army of the GDR was to be equipped, at the suggestion of the Soviet leading power, with a German steel helmet. They simply drew on the foundational work available at the ironworks Thales Harz. The result is the NVA steel helmet M56, used until 2nd October 1990. It is the last successor still made of steel of the steel helmet, whose career began in 1916 at Verdun. Part 2. The Panzerfaust. History of a German weapon. Simple, inexpensive, deadly. From 1942, engineers of the armaments company Hasag in Leipzig developed the Panzerfaust. What was initially conceived as an anti-tank weapon against the Soviet tank masses on the Eastern Front is later produced by the millions for the final battle for the Reich by tens of thousands of forced laborers. It is a scene like many that take place in Germany in the last days of the war. 18 April 1945, Leipzig, Saxony. On this Wednesday, soldiers of the 2nd U.S. Infantry Division cross the Elster-Saale Canal, coming from the west. GIs and tanks are also advancing along Karl-Heinz-Strasse toward the city center. From afar, one can hear the roar of the diesel engines of the Sherman tanks, the rattling of the tracks and the squeaking of the road wheels. Suddenly, a loud crash tears the air. A Sherman stands in flames in front of the main entrance of the Felsenkeller, a neo-Baroque hall building in the Plogwitz district. A 16-year-old Hitler youth has shot it down with a Panzerfaust. Hardly any weapon is as emblematic of the bloody and senseless last battles of the Second World War in Germany as the Panzerfaust. Its construction is relatively simple: a tube with a folding sight and trigger, from which a hollow charge projectile is fired. Depending on the version, the disposable weapon weighs between just under 7 and under 10 kilograms. It is inexpensive and quick to produce in large numbers, and comparatively simple to use, and it is damn deadly. Depending on the model, a Panzerfaust can penetrate armor 14, 20, or even 32 centimeters thick. The Panzerfaust is developed in Leipzig at Hasag, one of the largest armaments corporations of the German Reich and a giant in the field of munitions manufacturing. In 1943, 65,000 people produce infantry ammunition for machine guns, as well as onboard weapons ammunition for Luftwaffe aircraft at the Leipzig main factory and the branch factories in Berlin, the Sachsen-Taucha, Eastern Thuringian Altenburg, and in 3 plants in occupied Poland. More than half of Hasag's employees are forced laborers who have to toil under inhumane conditions. From 1943, in addition to munitions, mass production of the Panzerfaust is added. Leipzig Hasag engineers Wilhelm Renner and Edmund Heckler, one of the later co-founders of the Baden-Württemberg weapons manufacturer Heckler & Co., began developing the Panzerfaust in 1942. The goal was to provide the German soldier on the Eastern Front with a simple but effective defensive weapon against the powerful Soviet T-34 tanks. These were significantly superior to most German tank models of 1941 in armor, mobility, and firepower, and could not be cracked by then-standard German 3.7 centimeter anti-tank gun. Although from 1942 onwards, the Wehrmacht increasingly had access to improved tank types and entirely new tank models that were even superior to the T-34, German production numbers could not remotely keep up with the output of Soviet armaments factories. Over the course of the war, these reached 9 times the German tank production. In addition, after the United States entered the war in December 1941, the world's largest economic power also supplied the Soviet Union with armaments such as tanks and other weapons. Among the first U.S. weapons to reach the Soviet Army were the so-called bazookas. Some of these recoilless rocket-propelled anti-tank weapons were likely captured by Wehrmacht soldiers on the Eastern Front as early as 1942.
Based on them, German engineers later developed the improved rocket anti-tank rifle, the Panzerschreck. The weapon could penetrate up to 15 centimeters of tank steel at a distance of 200 meters. However, the rocket projectiles of the Panzerschreck were relatively expensive and complicated to produce. What the bazooka, Panzerschreck, and Panzerfaust have in common is the use of a hollow charge projectile. In a hollow charge, high explosive material is packed around a cone or hemispherical-shaped metal insert. The enormous pressure generated during its detonation cold forms the metal insert into a metal spike that can penetrate armored targets at high speed. The impacted tank steel melts in the process and can cause ammunition and fuel inside the tank to explode. The Germans were the first to use hollow charges in World War II. During the 1940 France campaign, Wehrmacht paratroopers used them to destroy the tank turrets of the Belgian fortress Eben Diemel. To have an effective close combat weapon against the Soviet T-34 tanks, a magnetic hollow charge was developed from 1941, which could be attached to enemy tanks. The risk to the tank hunter was very high. The Panzerschreck and Panzerfaust reduced this risk because both weapons delivered the hollow charge to the enemy tank from a distance. Unlike the Panzerschreck, the Panzerfaust was not a rocket weapon. Its projectile was accelerated by a propellant charge from a simple metal tube, almost recoil-free, to speeds of up to 60 meters per second. The simple design made the disposable weapon cheap and allowed large quantities to be produced in a short time. However, the first Panzerfaust, delivered to the troops from the summer of 1943, could not shoot further than 30 meters. Later models, depending on the propellant charge, achieved effective ranges of 40, 80, 100, and finally 150 meters. The Panzerfaust design had another drawback. To compensate for the recoil energy of the projectile, the tube was open at the rear. The escaping recoil jet and cloud were so large, however, that they immediately revealed the firing position. Panzerfaust shooters were therefore instructed to immediately retreat after firing to avoid becoming targets for other tanks and accompanying infantry. In the hands of specially trained anti-tank command units, the Panzerfaust was still a dangerous close combat weapon. However, the majority of German tank kills continued to be carried out by tanks, tank destroyers, and assault guns. The Panzerfaust remained a weapon of last resort, accounting for less than 2% of tank kills on the Eastern Front, according to a Wehrmacht statistic from January 1944. Nevertheless, the National Socialists soon placed great hopes in the supposed wonder weapon from Haysag. In June 1944, Armaments Minister Albert Speer classified the Panzerfaust as critical to the war effort. With the special authority Hauchlauf Panzerfaust, the Leipzig Armaments Company was instructed to deliver 1.5 million anti-tank weapons per month. In the Schlieffen subcamp of Brandenburg, Jewish and other concentration camp prisoners were forced to work under inhumane conditions for this purpose. Large quantities of Panzerfaust were indeed produced in Haysag factories, although the requested 1.5 million per month were likely never reached. The closer the front moved to the Reich border toward the end of the war, the more the Panzerfaust was celebrated by Nazi propaganda as a supposed means of achieving final victory. By the formation of the Volkssturm in September 1944 at the latest, it had become a staple in newsreels shown in cinemas and in propaganda magazines. The images showed elderly men firing Panzerfaustes on Sundays and women in hats and fur coats elegantly practicing the seemingly effortless destruction of a few enemy tanks. When Volkssturm battalions, made up of old men and boys from the Hitler Youth, were supposed to defend the Reich from early 1945, alongside exhausted Wehrmacht units against the advancing Allied armies, Panzerfäuste were by no means scarce. While there was a shortage of infantry weapons and ammunition, uniforms, and military boots everywhere, the Haysag anti-tank rifles were sufficiently available. Even in the place where the Panzerfaust was developed in 1942, this was the case. When in April 1945, the new combat commander of Leipzig, Colonel Hans von Ponnet, deployed the Volkssturm men under his command against advancing U.S. troops, only every third of them possessed a firearm. Panzerfäuste, however, were abundant. On 18 April 1945, a 16-year-old Hitler Youth grabbed one of the weapons and destroyed a Sherman tank at the Plagwitz Felsenkeller. The 5 crew members burned. The shooter himself did not survive the engagement either. He was killed shortly afterward in the hail of bullets from another combat vehicle. The recoil cloud of his Panzerfaust had given him away. Part 3. Wehrmacht Paratroopers, beginnings of a controversial elite unit. The German parachute troops in the Second World War are surrounded by a certain mystique, behind which their origins often fade. Hitler himself is said to have been the idea's originator. The model was provided by the Soviets, but the birthplace of the new branch of arms lies in the Altmark, where the first parachute school was established in Stendal in 1936. A new exhibition at the Military History Museum in Dresden examines the myth of the parachuter. Here is a look at the beginnings of a controversial elite unit. According to an anecdote circulated by Adolf Hitler's private secretary Christa Schroeder, the Nazi dictator was the intellectual originator of the German parachute weapon. Allegedly, in 1935, he saw on the cover of an illustrated magazine during a cafe visit in Munich a photo of 200 Soviet paratroopers jumping. While his entourage amused themselves over the Great Bluff, Hitler is said to have cut the photo out and silently put it in his pocket. 2 days later, he summoned Luftwaffe chief Hermann Göring and presented him with the plan to form the first German parachute regiment. To what extent the anecdote is accurate cannot be finally determined. It is certain, in any case, that the model for the new German branch was the Soviet parachute troop. As early as 1928, the Soviet Union was the first country in the world to establish parachute units, and from 1930 used them in maneuvers. In a 1935 exercise in the Kiev military district, over 1,000 parachute troopers of the Red Army jumped. It is probably a photo from that maneuver that also reached Hitler in the same year. The German military attaché in Moscow had been sending reports on the development of the Soviet parachute troops to the German Army High Command since 1932. The chief of the General Staff of the German Air Force, Generalleutnant Walter Wever, who was appointed when the Luftwaffe was founded on 1 March 1935, also presented these reports to his superior, Göring. It is quite possible that Göring saw in the parachute weapon an opportunity to further enhance his position in the Nazi state. But even if the idea to build a parachute troop should have come more from Göring than from Hitler, the Führer still had to give his approval. In the autumn of 1935, the Luftwaffe chief received the green light to build a parachute troop. Göring, the second man in the Nazi state, and since 1933 also in control of the Prussian police, initially drew on the regiment General Göring, which had been transferred from the Prussian state police to the Luftwaffe in October 1935. The roots of Göring's favored unit go back to the police detachment ZBV Wecke, formed in February 1934 from staunch National Socialists. Former Wecke policemen also made up the entire officer corps of the regiment General Göring in 1935.
Almost all of these officers belonged to the 600 volunteers who, in October, responded to Göring's call for the formation of a parachute battalion and a parachute pioneer company. In the subsequent reorganization of the regiment General Göring, the I Jaeger Battalion was initially formed in November 1935. It was later renamed the IV Fallschirmschützen Battalion. It was the Wehrmacht's first parachute infantry unit ever. Its staffing with many early National Socialists would leave a lasting imprint on the unit. Shortly thereafter, the 15th Parachute Pioneer Company of the regiment General Göring was established as the second German parachute unit. However, the founding day of the German parachute weapon is considered to be 29th January 1936. On that day, Luftwaffe Chief Göring ordered that 15 officers, non-commissioned officers, and junior leaders of the regiment, due to voluntary applications, be trained as the future instructional staff for parachute training of the regiment General Göring's parachute units. For the recruitment of these and future volunteers for the parachute troop, the Luftwaffe's selection criteria were adopted. Applicants had to prove flight fitness, weigh under 85 kilograms, and be physically well trained. Also, unlike in other Luftwaffe units, an unreserved commitment to the National Socialist state appears in the later set of requirements for the parachute troop.
The actual birthplace of the new branch was the Stendal-Borstel airfield in the Altmark. From February 1936, Luftwaffe officers under Hauptmann Friedrich Wilhelm Immans, a former First World War fighter pilot and later member of the Hamburg Flieger SA, built the Wehrmacht's first parachute rifle school there. At the institution, formally opened on March 1, 1936, volunteers for the parachute weapon were initially trained in 7-week courses. From March 1937, the then Major Gerhard Bassenger became commander of Parachute School 1. Under him, the school developed into a leading office where proposals for the use of the parachute troop were worked out and technical developments advanced. In the Luftwaffe General Staff, the parachute weapon was initially understood as a complement to its own air attack concept. Where high-value targets could not be destroyed by bombing, paratroopers were to do the job. The paratroopers were to be dropped in small groups behind enemy lines and act as demolition and sabotage troops with the help of explosives carried with them. Accordingly, their training was initially tailored to the profile of military individual fighters. In line with the so-called destroyer tactic, the IV Fallschirmschützen Battalion of the regiment General Goering was at times also referred to as a parachute destroyer battalion. In parallel with Goering's paratroopers, the Army established a parachute infantry company as an experimental unit in 1937, which was expanded into a parachute infantry battalion in June 1938. Since the Army had no parachute school of its own, the unit was stationed in Stendal and trained at the Luftwaffe's parachute school there. Unlike the Luftwaffe's destroyer tactic, the Army's parachute infantrymen were intended to fight as a cohesive infantry unit behind enemy lines after the jump, and hold key terrain until they could link up with advancing tank units. For this purpose, they were also equipped with machine guns and grenade launchers. However, Hitler soon put an end to the divergent development trends of the German parachute weapon. On 1 January 1939, he ordered the Parachute Infantry Battalion of the Army to be transferred to the Luftwaffe. It was integrated as the 2nd Battalion into the newly formed Parachute Regiment 1. The 1st Battalion of the new regiment was provided by the previous IV Fallschirmschützen Battalion of the regiment General Goering. The 3rd Battalion of the new Parachute Regiment was formed from Luftwaffe personnel in the Altmark town of Garda-Legen. Parachute Regiment 1, in turn, formed the core element of the Parachute Division, which had already been established under the cover designation 7th Air Division on 1 September 1938. All parachute and air landing units of the Wehrmacht were brought together under its command. Since paratroopers were intended to fight as infantry after landing, the 7th Air Division was also organized according to the structure of a classic infantry division with 3 regiments. However, since initially only one true parachute regiment existed, the 7th Air Division was temporarily supplemented with 2 air landing infantry regiments. Their soldiers were not parachutists. They were to land with 252 transport aircraft on airfields previously captured by the paratroopers. One of the 2 air landing infantry regiments initially subordinated to the 7th Air Division was Infantry Regiment 16 of the 22nd Infantry Division of the Army. The 2nd Air Landing Infantry Regiment of the division was formed from paramilitarily pre-trained members of the SA Standarte Feldherrenhalle, whose Honor-Standartenführer Göring had been since January 1937. It was only in 1939 that the formation of Parachute Regiment 2 began. The 1st Battalion was established in Tangerwunde and the 2nd Battalion in Stendal. A large portion of the volunteers of the new regiment consisted of former members of the SA Standarte Feldherrenhalle, which had previously been transferred to the Luftwaffe as air landing infantry. This personnel transfer from a Nazi organization further reinforced the close connection of the parachute force to National Socialism. A 3rd Luftwaffe parachute regiment was not formed until the summer of 1940, based on the 2nd Battalion of Parachute Regiment 1, i.e. the former Parachute Infantry Battalion. Göring appointed Kurt Student as commander of the 7th Air Division as early as 4th of July 1938. The then General Major, like Göring, a fighter pilot in the First World War, is considered the actual creator of the German parachute force.
In 1936, as a military observer in the Soviet Union, student witnessed nearly 1,200 paratroopers in a maneuver liberating an entire airfield, which was then occupied by 5,000 air-landing soldiers. Under his leadership, the 7th Air Division was expanded into a full division with all necessary support troops. For example, in the summer of 1938, an air support battery was established in Gardelegen. In addition, transport, reconnaissance, combat, and fighter wings of the Luftwaffe were assigned to the 7th Air Division for support. Student wanted to develop the paratroop force from its initially limited tactical orientation into an instrument of operational, indeed battle-deciding significance, as he later put it. He admitted, however, that he had not been able to come to terms with the previously prevailing destroyer tactic of the paratroopers. In particular, the chances for soldiers to return had seemed too low to him, which inevitably undermined the morale of the troops. Nevertheless, it was initially tactical air-landing operations that brought the paratroop force a reputation in the spring of 1940 in Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The German paratroopers captured bridges and airfields. In North Norway, at Narvik, they jumped to support mountain troops and marines trapped by British-French expeditionary forces. In Belgium, on 10 May 1940, they landed with gliders on the fortress Ibn Emal, which they captured using innovative magnetic hollow charges. An air-landing large-scale operation against The Hague, intended to capture the Dutch government, ended in a fiasco. 1,200 paratroopers were taken prisoner in the battle for Ypenburg airfield. Nevertheless, Student remained committed to the concept of operational large-scale deployments for his paratroop force. On 1 January 1941, he was given the corresponding structure for this purpose, with the 11th Air Corps. In addition to the 7th Air Division as the core unit, the Air Landing Corps also included a glider-equipped Air Landing Assault Regiment and additional support troops. In the spring of 1941, the Corps also had its own reconnaissance squadron and 10 transport aviation groups with around 500 Ju-52 transport aircraft. Equipped in this way, the Parachute Corps, reinforced with 3 mountain infantry regiments and supported by strong Luftwaffe combat aircraft, was to capture the Greek Mediterranean island of Crete at the end of May 1941. More than 3,000 German paratroopers would not survive the first major airborne operation in the history of warfare. Part 4. Crete, 1941, when thousands of paratroopers jumped to their death. On 20 May 1941, German paratroopers launched the first major airborne operation in the history of warfare. On Crete, they faced an overwhelming force of determined defenders. Only after days of brutal combat and with heavy losses were they able to capture the island. In the end, 6,000 Wehrmacht soldiers alone were dead, missing, or wounded. The Greek king Pyrrhus I of Epirus, who in 279 BC achieved an extremely costly victory against the Romans, is credited with the saying, "Another such victory and we are lost." Since then, a success purchased at too high a cost has been called a Pyrrhic victory. Whether Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill thought of this when he decided at the end of April 1941 to defend Crete against the Germans is unknown. To the Commander-in-Chief for the Middle East, General Sir Archibald Wavell, he at least communicated that he saw the opportunity to inflict significant losses on the German paratroopers in the Battle of Crete. Wavell himself was less optimistic. The 30,000-strong remainder of the British Expeditionary Corps on the Greek Mediterranean island was in a desolate state. All heavy weapons had been abandoned in southern Greek ports while fleeing the Wehrmacht. But the British forces in Egypt, where Wavell had his headquarters, were also in a poor position. A German-Italian blitz campaign had recently expelled them from Libya. The Commander-in-Chief of Middle East Command would have preferred to evacuate Crete and redeploy the freed-up forces to the beleaguered Libya front. However, the leadership in London insisted on holding Crete at all costs. The island, located about 100 kilometers south of the Greek mainland, was an important outpost for the defense of Egypt and thus the Suez Canal. Additionally, from the 260-kilometer-long Mediterranean island, advances into the Aegean and southeastern Europe were possible. The British were certain that the Wehrmacht would attack the island. British intelligence reported that the German paratroopers who captured the bridge over the Corinth Canal on 26 April had not withdrawn from Greece. At the same time, approximately 250 transport aircraft from Germany were being relocated to Plovdiv in Bulgaria. In fact, As early as 21 April, leading representatives of the Luftwaffe, including the creator of the German paratroop force, General der Flieger Kurt Student, convinced Adolf Hitler to capture Crete using airborne and paratrooper units. The Luftwaffe generals were so insistent on taking Crete, partly for reasons of prestige. In the Battle of Britain in 1940, their branch of the service had suffered a major defeat in the fight for air supremacy over Great Britain.
Student himself also wanted to demonstrate the great feats his paratroopers were capable of. Hitler, however, was initially skeptical. He feared a delay in the planned June invasion of the Soviet Union. For this reason, he had previously rejected the capture of Malta, from where German supply lines for North Africa were threatened. Using the argument that Royal Air Force bomber units could attack the oil fields of Ploiesti in Romania, crucial for German fuel supply, from Crete, the Luftwaffe generals found an open ear with Hitler. The German dictator was determined to avoid the risk of his tank forces running out of fuel in the east. With Directive Number 28 for Operation Mercury, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe, through Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, to capture Crete on 28 April. Luftflotte 4, under General Oberst Alexander Löhr, was tasked with preparing and executing the operation. For the first major airborne operation in history, Student's 11 Air Corps, a special large unit for such operations, was available. At its core was the 7th Air Division with 15,000 paratroopers. In addition, there was an air landing assault regiment equipped with gliders for silent landings in the operational area.
For the air transport of the paratroopers, more than 500 Ju-52 transport aircraft were available. Student's Air Landing Corps also had its own reconnaissance squadron. For the air battle over Crete, the 11th Air Corps was reinforced by mountain troops of the 5th Mountain Division to be brought in by air and sea. 280 bombers, 150 dive bombers, 140 fighter aircraft, and 40 reconnaissance planes were to prepare, support, and secure the attack. Nevertheless, the Crete operation was plagued from the start. Due to the imminent planned attack on the Soviet Union, Hitler initially demanded the operation to begin by mid-May. Given the considerable difficulties of assembling the necessary troops and equipment in structurally weak and war-damaged Greece, the start of the attack was postponed to 20 May. Even this timing, however, was far too early for a highly complex airborne operation that relied heavily on thorough preparation and precision. Additionally, German reconnaissance failed. They missed the fact that the British were able to completely reorganize their troops on Crete and equip them with heavy weapons. The corresponding sea transports from Egypt were landed overnight in the Cretan ports. Perfectly camouflaged, the numerous new anti-aircraft artillery positions, machine gun nests, and entrenched tanks remained hidden from German reconnaissance aircraft during the day. Even a violent reconnaissance by German combat aircraft does not provoke the pre-force troops, composed of British, Australian, New Zealander, and Greek soldiers. They respond to attacks as cautiously as possible and maintain their camouflage. Until shortly before the invasion begins, the Germans estimate only 12,000 defenders across all Crete. In reality, there are 42,000. On the morning of May 20, 1941, when the airborne battle for Crete begins, approximately 5,000 to 6,000 German paratroopers of the first wave, landing in the western part of the island, face nearly 29,000 Cree Force soldiers, at least the men of the Airborne Assault Regiment, who descend by gliders west of Malame Airfield into a dry river valley, are able to secure their landing zone. However, they are far from capturing the airfield, their primary objective. The defensive fire of the British is simply too strong. For the paratroopers landing simultaneously south of the then-island capital Chania, the situation is even worse. Many of them jump directly into British positions, which means certain death for many. It is somewhat more favorable for the soldiers landing by glider near Chania. They have their heavy infantry weapons with them and do not need to retrieve them from dropped containers. Nevertheless, their losses are high. Accomplishing their mission to take Chania and the port of Souda Bay,
is out of question, even for them. In this critical situation, reinforcements should have been flown in immediately. If it had been up to Air Fleet Chief Lohr, responsible for operational planning, this would have happened. Lohr originally wanted to concentrate all available forces, paratroopers, transport planes, bombers, and fighters on the western part of Crete, with the key Maleme airfield and the large landing harbor in Souda Bay. Luftwaffe Chief Goering and Paratrooper Chief Student, however, argued for taking all important points of the island simultaneously by air. Such a broadly planned operation could not have been supported with the available air forces. A compromise was reached. At least in a second wave on May 20th, the airfields of Rethymnon in the center of Crete and Heraklion in the east of Crete would also be seized. At these two locations, the operation is even more chaotic than in the west. Because the combat and transport planes have to be hand-fueled before the second approach to the airfields in southern Greece, the start times are delayed by hours. Additionally, the planes taking off first stir up the dry runways so much that the start of later aircraft is significantly delayed. As a result, too much time passes between the bombing of the British positions and the dropping of the paratroopers.
Furthermore, the paratrooper groups of the second wave are not dropped together due to the time delays, but only individually. Their losses are therefore even higher than those of the first wave. Every second paratrooper landing in the afternoon at Rethymnon and Heraklion falls either during the jump or within the first minutes of combat. Those who survive unscathed have enough to do defending themselves. Capturing the local airfields is out of the question. The situation is different in the West, with the paratroopers of the Airborne Assault Regiment at Maleme Airfield. An attack on the commanding heights initially fails against the stubborn defense of the local New Zealanders. However, the local New Zealand commander, due to a lack of communications, gains the false impression that his men are far too weakened to withstand another Luftwaffe bombing the following day. He therefore pulls them 3 to 4 kilometers east to Chania. Only because of this are the men of the Airborne Assault Regiment able to advance and, over the course of the night, seize parts of Maleme Airfield. This makes the situation at Maleme the most promising. Air Fleet Chief Lohr and the 2 corps commanders, Student and Richthofen, therefore decide to drop paratroopers once again as reinforcements west of Maleme on May 21. With their help, the airfield is finally fought free. Already by late afternoon, the first transport planes with mountain troops land on the airfield. Since the landing area is still under British fire, numerous planes are destroyed. By evening, over 80 Juker 52 transport planes are destroyed or damaged on the airfield. Nevertheless, soldier losses remain low. The leadership of the Cree force recognizes the danger posed by the Germans' capture of Maleme. On the night of May 22, they attempt a counteroffensive to retake the airfield. However, as German bombers resume attacks with the first daylight, the British assault completely collapses. Against German air superiority, the British have no chance. Especially with the now increasingly arriving mountain troops and other airborne units at Maleme, it is possible in the following days to relieve the paratroopers trapped at Chania and Rethymnon and push the British further back. Nevertheless, the British managed to withdraw the bulk of their Cree forces fighting in western Crete unharmed over the Lefka Avi Mountains to Horas Fakion. From there, by June 1, 13,000 soldiers are evacuated to Egypt over 4 nights. The nearly 5,000 Australians east of Rethymnon, however, fall into German captivity on May 30th. The approximately 8,000 British at Heraklion are loaded onto ships on the night of May 28th, 29th, some of which are sunk by German aircraft east of Crete at dawn. Nevertheless, about half of the Empire troops succeed in fleeing Crete. Around 3,500 British, Australian, New Zealander, and Greek soldiers are killed or wounded in the fighting for the island. At least 17,000 fall into German captivity. The German victors, of course, suffer hardly any losses in prisoners. However, the 11th Air Corps loses around 6,000 men, killed, missing, or wounded,
in the airborne battle for Crete. Most of these are paratroopers. A later evaluation lists 3,339 fallen and 83 missing soldiers. Furthermore, more than 185 of the 500 Junkers transport planes of the Airborne Corps are lost. Nevertheless, Air Fleet Chief Luhr declares after the conclusion of the fighting on June 2nd, "True to the oath we have sworn to the Führer and Commander-in-Chief of the Wehrmacht, we stand ready for new tasks." Yet, at least in terms of new tasks in the sense of large airborne operations, nothing more happens until the end of the war. Crete is a Pyrrhic victory for the German paratroopers. British Prime Minister Churchill later sees it the same way. Even though recent research indicates that especially young and inexperienced paratroopers suffered the greatest losses during Operation Mercury, the experienced leadership personnel also suffer severe casualties. The unit never fully recovers. Although in the following years more and more volunteer paratroopers are trained, and by 1944, the 11th Air Corps even became a full airborne army, its members are de facto paratroopers in name only. Large-scale airborne operations, like Crete, will never again be attempted by the Wehrmacht until 1945.
Part 5. When Germans and British played football at the front on Christmas 1914. On Christmas Day 1914, German and British soldiers in Flanders left their trenches and played football together in no man's land. Leading the fraternizations of the Christmas truce on the Western Front of the First World War were also soldiers from Saxony. It all begins with a world-famous Christmas carol. On Christmas Eve 1914, it was just a single German soldier at the German-British front near the northern French town of Armentières who loudly intoned "Silent Night, Holy Night." But soon the melody spread along the entire German trench over many kilometers. From thousands of men's throats came the words, "Sleep in heavenly peace." The festive mood also spread to the British soldiers in their trench, as Lieutenant Johannes Niemann of the 9th Royal Saxon Infantry Regiment No. 133 later recalled, "And so it came about that the war transformed into the peaceful form of a singing contest, and the warlike spirit on both sides was lost in Christmas mood." For the first time in weeks, the soldiers on that evening of December 24, 1914, experienced a sense of happiness while celebrating and singing together, a mood that did not disappear on the following first Christmas Day. It was probably the Saxon soldiers who first, on Christmas morning, climbed out of their trenches in Niemann's company sector, near Furlinghen in French Flanders, and approached the British lines. In other sectors where Germans were on one side and English, Scottish, Irish, or Welsh on the other, similar fraternization scenes occurred in no man's land during the 1914 Christmas truce. They buried the fallen together, conversed, exchanged small gifts, cigarettes, cigars, or simply shared a sip from a flask of schnapps, whiskey, or rum. The soldiers also questioned the purpose of the killing imposed upon them. "We are Saxons, you are Anglo-Saxons. Why should we shoot each other?" one Saxon infantryman put it succinctly. Niemann himself later even suggested that perhaps the Tommies saw their ancestors, the Anglo-Saxons, in the Saxons. In any case, Saxons and Anglo-Saxons got along perfectly well on December 25, 1914. However, that first Christmas Day did not end just with music and singing contests. It became sportive as well. Niemann wrote in his memoirs, "Suddenly a Scot brought a football, and a proper football game developed, with hats laid down as goals. Although the hard frozen cabbage field in no man's land between Furlinghen and Le Touquet did not allow for a proper match, all players and spectators were filled with peaceful and sportive togetherness. If someone fell in the mud, the opponent helped him back on his feet," according to the Saxon officer.
In other places along the Western Front, Germans and British also began kicking a ball against each other on Christmas Day, 1914. Lieutenant Kurt Ziemisch, a company commander from Plauen in the 10th Royal Saxon Infantry Regiment No. 134, whose company was stationed at the Plogstert Forest near St. Yvon, reported that
A few Englishmen brought a football out of their trench, and an enthusiastic football match began. Among the Saxons, soldiers from Leipzig, where the German Football Association was founded in 1900, were particularly interested in the game. In the end, probably hundreds or even thousands of German and Allied soldiers played football against each other during the 1914 Christmas truce on the front in Belgium and France. Among soldiers of the United Kingdom, leather balls were already widespread. Where no ball could be found, a piece of straw wrapped in wire would do. In a pinch, an empty tin can was used. The English soldier Ernest Ernie Williams of the Cheshire Regiment described how spontaneously the football matches arose. We set up some sort of goals. 2 lads went in, and then everyone kicked. There were already a few hundred men. During the general kicking, everyone had fun. No one cared about the score. There was no referee, there were no goalposts. Even the dirty, heavy boots alone prevented a proper match. Nevertheless, reports later repeatedly claimed that in various sections of the Western Front, real football matches took place, with referees and regular halves. The British newspaper The Times first reported on New Year's Day 1915, citing an anonymous British major of an unknown regiment, about a German victory over an English team. Lieutenant Niemann from Saxony fueled the legend by reporting a 3-2 victory for his Saxons. The Diary of the Lancashire Fusiliers also mentions the 3-2 win for the Fritzen, Germans. However, here the winning goal was allegedly scored from offside. Another report describes a Bedfordshire regiment losing 2-3 against the Germans. All these reports of formal football matches during the 1914 Christmas truce on the front in Belgium and France are likely legends. This, however, does not change the fact that there were indeed a series of spontaneous kicks between German and British soldiers. Nor does it change the fact that German and Allied soldiers, in the midst of the Great War, refused to kill their enemies on the feast of Christ's birth. It would almost be the last time in this war. With the promise of their leaders, only one decisive battle, only one last hardship, and only one final victory, they were driven through the blood mills of the First World War until 1918. In the end, more than 9.5 million of them were dead. On November 11, 2008, in the French village of Frelingien, the first monument to the 1914 Christmas truce was inaugurated in memory of the football game once played between Saxon and British soldiers. British and Saxon soldiers again played a football match there, a fitting tribute to the heroes of the Little Peace in the Great War who loved their enemies instead of hating them.